Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today, we're going to have parts 3 and 4 of the Silk Road mini-series. Parts 1 and 2 focused mostly on the Occident, the westernmost reaches of the Silk Road, and the middle part, parts 3 and 4, will be on what I'm going to call West Asia. This area is called the Middle East a lot today. I think that's a really terrible term because it doesn't make any sense. Middle of what and east of what exactly? So we're going to be calling it West Asia. I'll throw up a map now and you'll see this is the Asian continent. This is the westernmost reaches of the Asian continent. It's much simpler. It actually makes sense. You can point to it on a map. So we're going to call it West Asia. The last two parts will be on East and South Asia, mostly India and China. And then we'll take a look at these three areas, the Occident, West Asia, and East and South Asia through time. And that'll be this series. So today we're going to look at West Asia, mostly Mesopotamia and Persia in this first episode, in the ancient and what led them to the Silk Road. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. We're going to look at ancient Mesopotamia, their geography, and their politics first. The land known as Mesopotamia was called that because it meant the land between the two rivers being the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers gave life to the land around them, allowing fertility, allowing farmers of the time to be able to produce food and surplus, but only really within a given area from the rivers. Surplus food back at this time, as we've mentioned before, would lead to specialization. The problem is, if you only have so much land that you can farm, there's only so much surplus that you can accumulate, and therefore only so much societal development that you can undergo as an individual culture. And that's exactly what happened. These areas coalesced into what we would call city-states. Uruk, Akkad, Sumer, all of these little places, they would have their own sort of language, their own religious structure, their own god that their city's leader was bound to or would represent. And these led to different cultural areas forming pantheons, where their gods in the sky were fighting over the land that their kings were fighting over for on the ground. It was much more difficult for one culture to completely destroy another one the way that, say, the Romans did with the Gauls or the Etruscans, because they all had very similar starting points and they all had very similar cultural backgrounds and ideologies, to where you couldn't really come in and replace a structure. You still needed to have something there to govern the people who lived there. So it led to this subjugation rather than outright conquest between these different cities, which meant that if you conquered 3 or 4 cities and your administration that you left behind after you died didn't do so well, it was very, very common for them to break back off. In Mesopotamia, the societal structure was very locally based. As they came out with new sets of laws and new sets of societal organization, these would sort of shift, but for the most part in ancient Mesopotamia, like in ancient Greece, we were looking at small individual societies competing with each other and with larger societies as well. So next, on to ancient Persia, today called Iran. The real difference between Persia and Iran is negligible. It comes down to what's called exonyms and endonyms. An exonym is a name that other people give to a country, An endonym is a name that a country gives to itself. Japan, we call Japan, they call themselves Nippon. China, it's either Zhonghu or Guangzhou, one of those is a city, but we call them China. It's an old practice. Most languages and cultures have exonyms. Spain, we call them Spain, they call themselves España. So back at this point, they were known to the outside world as Persia, and because they are very different from the modern day state of Iran, we're going to be calling this ancient Persia. So, ancient Persia, their trade, their religion, and the rise of Persia. Because Persia became one of the very first nations that sort of straddled all of what was known as the civilized world. They said that they owned the four corners of the world, and at their time they truly did, with the exclusion of maybe Egypt and Greece. But Persia started off as several settlements, Pasargadae, Persepolis, and a few other minor ones on the Persian Gulf. Much of what we know as modern-day Iran was later added. The original area of Persia was bounded to this area, will show up on the screen. And Persia was very lucky in the avenues of trade. They had access to the Persian Gulf, which gave them access further to Arabia, to India, and to Egypt. They could go up to the area known as Basra, which was where the Tigris and the Euphrates dump into the Persian Gulf, which is important because these rivers can be navigated upward towards modern-day Syria. They also had some more northern routes up to the areas near modern-day Afghanistan, which was important because, as we've talked about in previous videos, this was an area where you would have found tin. Tin and copper are needed to make bronze. Any society that wanted to not be invaded by its neighbors needed to have bronze. Also, of course, it was necessary for tools. Another really interesting point about ancient Persia that isn't talked about a lot was their religion. The cities of Mesopotamia would fight over one another, and they had their various gods and their pantheon that represented the individual cities, and an individual god from their pantheon would represent their ruler's control. So if you had Enlil, let's say from Ur, and a conqueror from Ur took over many other cities, they would say that Enlil had been risen up above the other gods and was subjecting them. Zoroastrianism took a very different approach to this. The prophet Zoroaster, hopefully I'll be able to do a special video on him specifically, we'll talk a little bit more about him later, came up and said that, yes, there are all of these minor gods that everybody knows about, that every town has one of their own, but there's one main god, and his name was Ahura Mazda, or the Mighty Wisdom. He was the god of wisdom, and as Zoroaster taught it, yes, there were many other gods, but they were all paths to the great god of learning, the god of wisdom. This would become very important later, and it was actually a step towards monotheism, which is a much more successful religious ideology for many reasons, which we'll look at a little bit later. Ancient Persia was very rich. They had good amounts of fertile soil. They had a more specialized agriculture, as we spoke on in the previous video. They developed citrus and a few other luxury items that would have traded a lot better than wheat or hay. And they also had very good administration, which at this time can be easy to overlook, but if you have a strong man, or what we would call a tin pot dictator, and his word is law, and nobody really knows what they can or can't do without being judged, it makes for a very unstable environment where people don't feel safe producing and storing their surplus. You need just laws, you need solid roads, and you need good administration if you were going to succeed at this time, and Persia had all of these. They had the most developed roads at the time, which all led to Persian cities, which funneled wealth, because if you were a trader and there was a well-established protected route, you would take that regardless of whether or not it was yours. This attracted traders and settlers, but it also was very important with the development of the ancient Persian concepts of freedom of idea. They didn't mind what your ideas were as long as they could be subjected to their own. That isn't the best set, but it is better than outright outlawing a lot of concepts. So ancient Persia was sort of poised from the beginning to overtake much of Mesopotamia and what would become modern-day Iran because of their rich trading routes, their roads, and their superior administration and laws. So this is a trade history and a geographic history, so let's take a look at trade next. Trade in ancient West Asia, their commodities, their luxuries, and their ideas, which was a very important export at the time. Mesopotamia had bounded areas of fertile food lands, which meant that this was one of the main resources that they were fighting over. And they also would harvest some stone and some clay to make ceramics. But as we've talked about previously, these are, other than food, mostly luxuries. So they had to rely on exports of their own food stores and of their higher order products to get in a lot of the things that they needed, such as bronze and wood, which was actually very important. There wasn't a whole lot of wood in ancient Mesopotamia, but all trade there was facilitated by boats. Sort of a conundrum. So they needed to have secure trade routes, even with their enemies and with other nations that they didn't necessarily agree with, or else they wouldn't be able to get the building blocks of their civilizations. Ancient Persia cultivated the same kinds of food, but they also had a lot more of luxury. They had citrus, they had some spices, and they had some other items. So their idea was mainly a lot like Egypt that we talked about. They wanted to be a safe haven where ideas and people could spread. They wanted to draw traders in towards themselves with the food from Mesopotamia in the west and the raw resources from the north and the spices and luxuries from the east. This was integral in the formation of the Silk Road. The Persian centerpiece, we could call it, held the Silk Road together for a very long time with the influx of food and some ceramics and artistic ideas from the west, the tin and the other ores from the north, and the special products, the silks and the spices from the east, all converging on this area before switching hands to go to the Orient or the Occident. Persia focused a lot also on administrative ideas. We do have things like the Code of Hammurabi, which came out of Mesopotamia, and several other law codes and languages, but they were more focused on dealing with their immediate civilization and their immediate subjects. Persia was much more far-sighted. The surplus of food that could be produced directly related to the specialization that could occur in that society. So if you're a society with limited amounts of land to produce food, then you're a society with limited amount of development that can occur. Because of this factor, war was endemic in ancient West Asia. In order to expand your society and your bureaucracy, you needed to expand your borders, which led to war. War being a zero-sum game. By zero-sum, we mean in order for you to gain, someone else has to directly lose. This was one of the first times where this concept really came into play, and it stands at great ends with the ideas of trade and free flow of ideas. Persian roads, again, can't really be underestimated enough. At the time, the Persian roads would have gone to the west, they would have gone up the rivers, they would have gone on to where Egypt could have seen them. It was the way that their military moved, it was the way that their traders moved, it was the way that their society moved. We talk a lot, especially in our culture today, about ancient Rome and their roads, but ancient Rome was very good at accepting ideas from other cultures. This is another thing that they picked up from the Persians. The Persians would allow anyone to come in and practice their ideas, and as long as that person's concepts were attached to their idea of 1,000 paths to one God, which pretty much anyone could be, they would allow successful ideas to bloom and to foster. This would become extremely important when Persia was uniting West Asia under Cyrus, which we'll get to. But at the time, ancient Persian trade was very successful, especially compared to many other areas, because they had several cities bound together in what would form satraps and satrapies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And their concept of administration was far-reaching their local needs. The ancient Persians had some luxuries, but their main product in their trade was their safety and their central location to the two very different markets of the Occident and the Orient merging in one area.